So the idea of this video is to give you some different ways to think about pacing in cross-country ski racing. It would be great if I could just tell you exactly how to pace, but I actually don't think that's possible. My strategy for pacing might not work for you, and your strategy for pacing might not work for me. And there could be a number of physiological and psychological reasons for this. A couple weeks ago in class, I talked about the way in which blood lactate levels relate to pacing. If your levels of blood lactate far exceed your body's ability to clear blood lactate, and this happens early in a race, say 2 kilometers into a 10-kilometer race, you likely have a very big problem. It's going to be very difficult to finish the race fast after you have a flood of blood lactate that dramatic. In fact, maybe impossible to finish the race fast. So part of our job then in becoming good at pacing is learning what it feels like to race really close to what I call the line. So what do I mean by the line? I mean the effort level at which you are generating blood lactate at a far greater rate than you can clear it. That's on the far side of the line, right? And so riding the line is figuring out how to get close to that point where you're generating more blood lactate than your body can clear without going so far over it that you are having a very big problem. You have too much lactic acid building up all of a sudden and you can't move fast anymore. So it's figuring out where this line is and how to ride that line. So where is the line? It might be tempting to think about the line in terms of our anaerobic threshold, which we've talked about, right? And that defines these effort level zones between zone 3 and zone 4. That line is the anaerobic threshold. And it's tempting to think about the line as that line. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated in part because the bodies of highly trained athletes are really good at recovering during a race, in the actual race. And they become really good at clearing lactic acid during the race. And so these highly trained skiers far exceed their anaerobic threshold during the race, maybe many times during the race, but they're able to recover. They're able to use the terrain, use the downhills, the flats in order to recover, and they're able to avoid a flood of lactic acid. So they're effectively riding that line, that very fine line. Becoming a really good ski racer, a lot of it is about figuring out how to do that. Okay, so what do the numbers say about pacing? This is a really interesting question that I started looking into today. We're lucky to have really good data on pacing of professional cross-country skiers. This is because at all of the World Cup races, they record splits. This means that they record times, not just for how fast you finish the race, but for how long it took you to do each lap of the race. On the World Cup, they might even measure your time at multiple points within each lap. With all this data, we can look at how the athletes ranked at any point in the race. So at 1 kilometer, we can see how fast all the athletes were going in comparison to each other at that 1 kilometer point. And FIS has a really great tool that allows you to do this, to look at this. So you go to the FIS website and you go to the results for any given race. I showed you how to do this a little earlier in the semester, but if you need me to show you how to find this, let me know and I can show you. So here we have all the races from this past weekend, the first World Cup of the year that happened in Ruka, Finland. And we can go to any of these races, these distance races. So here we have the 10-kilometer individual start classic race, the women's race, and we can click on that. This is the race, by the way, that I sent out earlier, the link to, and that Rachel was talking about pacing being very important in. So if we go, here we have the results. This is just the ranking of how the race finished. We have times, we have the time difference here, and even the points on the right. But if we go to this graph analysis tab here, we get this really pretty graph. And this graph is measuring pacing. So we have each of these lines representing one athlete who finished in the top 5. And we can see whoever is at 0 at the end is the winner of the race. In this case, Ebba Andersson. And so lower down is faster, right? And these lines are comparing time difference. What that means is that it's the difference in time between the leader and the people chasing after the leader. So at each of these points is one of the splits in the 10-kilometer race. So at 1.1 kilometers, Frida Karlsson of Sweden was winning. And Ebba Andersson was trailing in second, and you can see the difference is 4.3 seconds. So 4.3 seconds slower. Somewhere around the middle of this race, between 5 and 6 kilometers, Ebba Andersson started going faster than Frida Karlsson, because now we see Ebba Andersson is along the bottom here. And now at the 6.1 kilometer split, we can see Frida Karlsson is behind Ebba Andersson by 2.7 seconds. And by the end of the race, behind by 5.7 seconds. And so looking at this, what are we going to take from this graph? The standard interpretation of this graph is Ebba Andersson paced really smart because she started off slower than the leader and ended up finishing faster. That might suggest to us that she was conserving some energy, maybe riding below the line, and then had a lot of energy at the end to go faster and win, right? That's one possible interpretation of this. What if we look at a bigger data set, though? I became interested in this, and if you want to nerd out about the stats of cross-country skiing, there's really only one place to go, and that's this website, statisticalskier.com. And this website is kind of crazy. It's full of different stats about skiing. Okay, there's this post on here. It's called "Should You Start Fast or Slow?" And the statistical skier Jorn Elias makes kind of a contrarian argument on here, which we may or may not agree with, but it's definitely an interesting argument to evaluate, and he makes some really good points. Okay, one of the really interesting points he makes in this is that there really are only 2 ways, he claims, as skiers, that we can evaluate our pacing. Or the way he puts it is, there are two things we can compare our pacing to. Because he says, well, people often say, oh, I started too fast. And his response is, too fast compared to what? And so he says, the two things you can compare your pacing to, we can compare ourselves to how fast we theoretically could go and be able to sustain that pace throughout a race, right? So that is going to require perhaps some speculation, but the way he puts it is, the maximum speed that you personally could sustain during an entire race, we could compare to that theoretical maximum speed that we could sustain. And number two, we could compare ourselves to how other people are pacing. We could compare ourselves to the speed our competitors are traveling at. And that's what we were looking at when we were just looking at that graph of the splits from the World Cup. We were looking at how fast the competitors were going in comparison to the winner. Now, the important thing to remember here is the reason why he argues there are only these 2 points of comparison is that we can't just look at how fast we're skiing per kilometer. We've talked about this before, right? There are too many variables to take anything meaningful away from the fact that someone skied, say, a 3 minute kilometers for a 10-kilometer race, right? Because race courses are all different. Snow conditions are always different. We have the variable of wax being different every week. There are just too many variables to take anything meaningful away from. I skied a 3 minute kilometers for a 10-kilometer race, right? Yeah, so this post as a whole, it makes the point that when we assume that someone started a race too fast, we do this a lot, or we assume that we started a race too fast, we need to be asking ourselves, too fast compared to what? Because we're making an assumption. We're making an assumption that we know what would have happened had they started slower, right? That's what we would call a counterfactual. But we actually don't know what would have happened. We don't actually know what would have happened if the person had gone out slower. And so we don't know. We could say, it would be tempting to say, if Frida Karlsson had started slower, had been going, 4.3 seconds slower in her first kilometer and 6.5 seconds slower at her third kilometer, it would be tempting to say, if she had done that, maybe she would end up down here. Maybe she would end up beating Ebba Andersson had she gone slower. But we actually don't know. We don't know, because it's possible that she could have followed Ebba Andersson's trajectory, and then when she got to the end, ended up in the same place or just slower. We don't know. So this is very tricky. This gets complicated really fast, and it gets into some difficult territory. So with all of that uncertainty there, how do we figure out how to pace? If there's all this uncertainty around the data, which I think there is, I think it is a little uncertain what the data is telling us in these cases. Well, actually, I think we need to go back to this graph and look at this, because just to further get across the point that it's a little bit confusing what the data is showing. Here we have a graph which is comparing on the y-axis final position. So this would be how you finished the race. I finished the race in 10th place. I finished the race in 20th place. Compared to, on the x-axis, position after the first split. So the first split would be in this case, where you're at the 1 kilometer mark. And so if we look at any of these given data points here, so we can look at any of them, and so like this one stands out up here. This is a person who was in let's see, 11th place after the first split. And at the end of the race, on the y-axis, ended up in 91st place. So we look at that, we say, okay, that person paced terribly. They went out way too fast, right? Because they were in 11th in the beginning of the race, and probably they blew up and they ended up this far behind. But most people, where they are after the first split correlates pretty well with how they finish the race. So that's what this grouping kind of suggests, this grouping. So here's one sentence that illustrates this. Is, as an example, only about 1 time in 5 did a skier finish in the top 10 after passing through the first checkpoint outside of the top 15. So it's very uncommon, pretty uncommon. I wouldn't say very uncommon, pretty uncommon that people are starting way behind. They're ranked way behind at the beginning of the race, and at the end of the race, they make up a bunch of that time. Unlikely. And the reasons for this are also unclear. Okay, there might be different reasons for this, other than what makes smart pacing or the physiology of it. And so the point is, it's a little bit it's unclear what the data shows here. So to bring it back to what we can do, how we can figure out how to pace better, even with a little bit of uncertainty here. Personally, I think we need to go back to what I was talking about before with riding the line and thinking about the individual instead of trying to aggregate the data. As an individual, I think the best thing that you can do to figure out how to pace better is to practice, which is a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but I think that in this case, it's the best answer. And figure out personally for you, how can you ride the line, and what are your body's abilities to recover, clear lactic acid. Those are my brief thoughts. I think that maybe this is an area, though, in which we need to do a little bit more research in general. And I would be happy to discuss this with any of you, and I'm curious what you think. Okay.